Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining from around the world to the international chapter, regular meetup, monthly meetup, where we essentially get together, have a conversation, and share some amazing content that we have from the international QRCA community. And today we have Lauren who's joining us, Lauren Greehey, who will be presenting like one of my favorite poster sessions from the worldwide conference. One that really made me think, and also one that made me, in the nicest possible way, consider my own fragrance and my own smell, and kind of open me up to the world of fragrance in a way which it's been a while. I've worked in that space before, and it was actually lovely just to kind of engage in it again. So excited to have Lauren talk us through a presentation, which, by the way, was the award-winning poster session at the conference. So, and that was voted by all the people there. So congrats again for that, Lauren. See the doors that leads to and opens up to in the world of your professional experience. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lauren to present it and take us through it, and then we can chat afterwards. Yeah, enjoy.
Thanks, Dave. But yeah, so to kind of just get things started, I think the poster sessions that we had in QR at the Berlin Worldwide Conference were about 10 minutes in length. So with this session being just under 30 minutes, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to fill this space? How am I going to kind of talk things through? Like, how much am I going to talk? And then I realized that actually I'm a certified yapper, which is a very, very English phrase to say things. But basically, when it comes to fragrance, it's actually very difficult to get me to shut up. So what I'll do is just kind of share my screen here and hopefully get it to the full size. So the title of my poster was called Material Culture, Smell Sketches and Creative Expression. And when it comes to thinking about how I show you this, I realized I can't exactly show you my poster because this is all you'd see of it on a PowerPoint slide. So I had to get a little bit wordy with things. So I was happy with that. But just for those who haven't seen the poster that I presented at the conference, this is just a snapshot glance of what it looked like. So without further ado, I'm actually going to go right into things and talk to you about material culture. So when we think about material culture, it's coming from a perspective of stuff matters. The things that we interact with in a day-to-day basis, thinking about your favorite coffee cup that you use every single morning, through to the fragrances that you wear, to the glasses that you choose to wear, the jewelry and such. Stuff facilitates action, it communicates meaning, it allows us to do stuff. And as qual researchers, we're always concerned with the interpretation of things. We like to talk to people who use things so we can understand those real world context drivers of those social and those cultural kind of meanings that are imbued into those objects. We like to understand how they feature into those everyday routines because it's in those routines that meaning is accrued, it develops, it evolves over time. And when we want to think about material culture and how we interact with stuff, we come to know what we like over time, but how we interpret it is molded by a variety of different ways. And when you're thinking about kind of material culture and doing research with things, it's really good to have a scalar perspective. And this scalar perspective it's not just clean cut layers, they all interact with each other at entirely different points. So, just as a bit of an overview, you can start with the individual scale. So, individually, how do we use stuff to help construct and express our personal identities? Then you have a temporal factor of how do our preferences change over time as we age throughout our lifetimes. But likewise, how do they change on a day-to-day basis? How do those micro routines move to how we need to move throughout our everyday life? Then there's a social layer, a social scale of how do we interact and communicate with other individuals and other people in our communities? And how is that influenced by the culture in which we live? And then finally, at the kind of the biggest level is looking at space, the spatial component of scale. And it's understanding how the spaces interact, how we move around places, how we interact with space, how we move around those spaces to get through our day-to-day life. So thinking about stuff, matter, scale, we know that over time, stuff it becomes enriched with meaning. It's emboldened and nuanced with cultural narratives. It has the capacity to bring both affect and effect on us. And when it comes to kind of cultural insight and semiotics work alongside qualitative research, we look to the material world, to how people play with things, how people use things for guidance on how those kind of cultural meanings are given value through a physical object, but also how that value changes, how that meaning shifts over time. And understanding that kind of cultural context, we can begin to get to grips with the wider social and material world drivers of human behavior. And where that's relevant for a lot of us qualies is in terms of looking at how consumers interact with stuff. What makes a FMCG product like your laundry detergent special? What makes you keep going back to purchase that product? Is it the fact that it simply does a very good job at cleaning? It gets rid of that stain that every other detergent has failed to remove. Or is it something else? Does it bring an additional quality in terms of the fragrance, the sensory experience around that? Or is there something in the fabric softness? And when we want to look at material cultures and how consumers and people interact with stuff, it's always great to complement that kind of scalar perspective with a multimodal lens. And we're concerned with understanding how people make sense of stuff, how they build relationships with matter. And a multimodal material perspective starts with three kind of key components that lead on from one another. And that first point there is that it starts from the beginning, from us as conscious, cognizant, and feeling beings. We experience the world around us through all of the senses that are available to us, and we infer that meaning from patterns of information, from repeated encounters and exposure. They all constitute experience. Then we encounter, interact, and reconfigure those physical objects and what they signify to facilitate action. We make sense of the objects that we use by using them, by playing with them, by bringing them into the fold of our everyday routines. I can't think of much other uses for a cup of coffee, a cup in a morning, other than the fact that it holds my coffee. But would I like to use a different mug? No, because this material object is my material object that I wouldn't drink another cup of coffee from. It's everything, you know? So it's understanding how these very mundane items can have an impact on us and our routines, our mood, and how it can affect and impact our emotion. And the last point here on this slide is that we're constantly in a state of making choices. We use stuff to communicate that meaning. And when it comes to a qualitative research perspective, when you want to understand the impact of stuff, it's actually just best practice to go to the people who use it, to actually talk to them and to interact with them. And so taking a kind of broader context and all of that information there, my proposition has always been creative methods, art-based methods in qualitative research are designed to embrace complexity because they acknowledge the plurality of experience, the different ways of knowing within communities, within your own kind of microcosm of your own ecosystem, but then also across markets. And it helps foster an environment that can challenge your participants to think in very different ways, which always leads to much more fruitful findings in terms of the data that you have at the end. Also, creative techniques allow us to explore problems in very discursive ways. So it's going beyond sitting across from a participant on a table and asking them very surface level questions and then trying to endeavor to dig into that deeper meaning through language. Employing a creative or an arts-based technique, whether it's a collage or actively drawing and painting, allows them to engage different senses. It gets them to think out of their own comfort zone. It gets them to think differently about the questions that you're actually asking them and the things that you're asking them to represent in the art that they're creating. Arts-based methods, they lean into complexity. You can capture very obscure, liminal, ambiguous, complex little challenges that you would otherwise miss in a verbal conversation. Because you're challenging your participants to think differently, the responses that you get are going to be much more meaningful. They're going to be emotionally driven, but they're also going to be contextualized. They're going to be strengthened by that kind of post-rationalization because they're actively making sense of what you're asking them, but based on their embodied experience. At the heart of it, arts-based methods in qualitative research, they're collaborative, they're participatory, they're processual. You're actively working with your participants to uncover their experience, but you're working with them to refine ideas, to transform their own perceptions and create those pockets of surprise where it has a real world impact in terms of the insight that you would report back to an end client, for example. And lastly, arts-based methods as a tool of elicitation, as a challenge to participants to think differently and think outside of their own boxes. That can allow you to grasp those very kind of profound moments. So when you're understanding how individuals form relationships with stuff, you're understanding the cultural context. And when you're unpacking that cultural context within that object and that relationship that you have with that object, you can start to unpack those more discursive cultural matters, those things that aren't always tangible, but they are lived and they are felt. So that could be something like I've got there on the slide of like classism or trauma. You can use these methods to understand their experience, to understand why they're thinking the way that they're thinking, and how those material objects have helped them or have an impact in their everyday life. So the fun part around this is the spotlight on smell sketches. So smell sketches, and I'll show you a nice example in a second after this slide, is thinking about fragrance generally, more broadly. The fragrances we wear are a choice, and they're very much influenced by the experiences we have with scent across the entirety of our lifetime. And you can still deploy that kind of scalar perspective that I spoke about earlier to start to unpack those relationships with fragrance from that individual level. Is that the scent that you choose to wear, it becomes embodied. It becomes a tool of an outward expression, a self-expression of your own personal identity. Over time, our relationships with certain smells change. Scents often remind us of a person, a place, or a time. And you might have a scent that you wore in a certain relationship, and that relationship soured. And every time you smell that scent, you might have a very visceral reaction, and you're just like, nope, I think I might be sick. I need to get away from that smell. Sometimes those scents are incredibly powerful. And then you've got that social and cultural component, which has always been fascinating. And that is this idea that socially and culturally, we've often been taught that bad smells are a sign of kind of poor hygiene. And we constantly endeavor to strip our bodies of those natural scents, of those natural odors, while simultaneously using fragranced products to mask and express the best versions of ourselves. We want to create a blank canvas of our bodies so that we can use certain products to be the best version of ourselves. And likewise, there's always going to be a spatial lens because fragrances are ephemeral, they're fleeting, they're moving through the space once they've left the material object of the glass bottle. So understanding how the smell moves through space is always going to be an interesting kind of dynamic to explore. It's when you walk past someone on the street and you catch a whiff of their perfume and you think, oh, that smells lovely. Or if you've got a weird nose like mine and you can tend to identify that fragrance and you're just like, great choice. You know, there's so much going on when you're moving through those spatial kind of dynamics, and understanding how fragrance moves through space is always a super interesting lens to take. So here is an example of two smell sketches. The one on the left is autoethnographic, and that is that it's done by me. The one on the right is a participant smell sketch. So the nature of this kind of session and how these art as data, how it came into being, was from an unstructured interview. So I kind of walked around a department store with the participant. Then we went to a quiet space to sit down, to have a drink, to talk, and to paint. And we painted pretty much the same fragrances across the board. And as you can see here, both of these smell sketches are incredibly different. So taking that top left kind of sketch of each fragrance, so on each sketch, sorry, that is the visual representation of mine and my participants' encounter with Gabrielle by Chanel. Now, if you look at this kind of fragrance, we have two radically different interpretations of what this smell looks and feels like. And what's really fascinating about the smell sketch is that it's a testament to the plurality and the complexity of the human experience in something that is quite perhaps ambiguous in terms of understanding relationships with scent. And when you're looking at these smell sketches, they become a piece of data. So whilst the participants talking to me about, well, I think it smells airy, breezy, open, fresh, clean, crisp, the colors they're selecting aren't always just about how they're trying to represent the scent as a literal physical material object, but it's very much influenced by their lifetime's worth of experiences with fragrance. So as the smell sketch comes into being, what you find is that people start to choose colors that not only reflect the fragrance that they're smelling, but also their emotions and their memories, and different kinds of relationships are coming into this piece. So the sketch that comes out as an end product is very, very rich because you've got the actual scent, you've got the emotion, you've got memory, you've got interpretation, and you've got a lot of complexity to then unpack. So when you want to analyze a sketch and actually use it as a piece of data in qualitative research, it's really quite you've got to be a bit creative with how you do it. So you've got a very artistic, creative piece of data, but understanding how to make sense of that in terms of the broader research context within the confines of the project that you're working in, you've got to be a little bit fun. So you've got to layer on the meaning. So I used acetate overlays to annotate and kind of analyze what the smell sketch was telling me. And adding on these physical layers, it creates that visual hierarchy where you've got this kind of, with effective kind of coding, you can begin to unpack and unpick the social and the material and the cultural world context around this encounter. You can add in those anecdotes and those quotes from the interview from when the participant was talking to you about, well, I chose this color because it reminded me of X, Y, and Z. So you're layering that meaning to build this bigger picture, to capture and visually represent that lived experience of that fragrance. Obviously, as I mentioned at kind of the start when I was talking through those sketches, every sketch is in fact unique. You can establish that individual context to answer why it was painted the way that it was painted. And what's great about art as a method in this sense is that you can uncover those hidden details. Sometimes it's very difficult to talk about certain topics. Sometimes language actually just fails us when we want to talk about fragrance, and especially ones that we love or ones that we don't like. Normally it can boil down to, well, that's pleasant. I like that. I don't really like that. But how do you get a bit deeper? And this is where the smell sketches became really fascinating as a method of data collection, because you're naturally just digging far deeper into meaning and meaning making processes. Likewise, it's that visual representation. And the medium I chose was watercolor, and it worked really well across the board because everyone could just play with the density, the shape, the movement of the color, however they best saw fit, whatever best captured their experience of that fragrance. But like I mentioned, whilst you're immortalizing that encounter with the scent on a page, you're also capturing their emotions and their memories with the experience. And just to end on this slide here, is that when it comes to materiality and creative or arts-based methods, it's pretty natural. It's kind of what we do in our daily lives already. We all have these relationships with material objects. They have an impact on us, and we have an impact on the stuff that we use because we choose to buy it. So when you think about all of the scale of the choices that are made when you're actively painting your data, when you're actively going through this, is that you actually have an unparalleled level of qualitative richness. The tool, in this sense, the smell sketch, is a medium for expression and elicitation. It allows those participants in that moment to reflect on the experience of the moment, but also past experience. We can call the sketch into being and give it even more meaning through the analysis. We use words and language to enhance the sense-making component of this data, to understand how meaningful the smell sketch is in representing scent. And understanding that really starts to open doors, because it can lead into kind of new product development, it can lead into fragrance development, it has a wide range of impacts. But in the best interest of time, I'll actually stop now and see if you guys have any questions.
So many. I've been writing, but Florian, do you have any questions? Well, yeah, you answered one of mine, because I was like, how on earth do you analyze something like that? But also, what would be a typical, because I can imagine, I mean, I know you took, perfume as one, but obviously the applications of this are so varied. What would be a kind of research objective or a typical research objective, for this type of project? Or what would the brand be trying to achieve, by using this method?
Yeah. And so one example from a project I ran last year, I had an online community, but then I had reconvened in-home immersions. So I'm going into people's homes, and the research objective for that project was very much about understanding fragrance preferences of predefined segments. So understanding that these segments within the FMCG category the client wanted to understand, well, is there any difference between these segments and the types of fragrances that they like? Like what triggers them to buy a product? What triggers them to repeat purchase? Are there any differences by those segments? Because when you look at FMCG, it's always been quite consistent and standard until the last 3-4 years, where you've seen a bit of an explosion of different kind of blends and fragrance compositions in laundry, household cleaning, all of these different kinds of products that we interact with on an almost daily basis. But the client was just like, well, how do I design a fragrance for this segment? Where do I even begin? Are there any kind of commonalities or themes, or is there anything around how they interact with scent that I should take into consideration? Should I use this to brief those fragrance houses when I need to design a product? How do I tell them to make a fragrance that will work in a certain way for this audience? So it was a very hyper specific project with a hyper specific objective. But I think the broader kind of thesis statement, if you will, is that it doesn't always have to be a sketch about smells. You can use it in kind of more complex, more nuanced, more kind of perhaps politically charged or challenging projects. Because if at its base level, the smell sketch it's still a tool for elicitation. But the idea of art and engaging those different senses challenges your participants to think differently. So whilst I love fragrance and I use it as for smell sketches, it doesn't always have to be about the smelly stuff.
Florian.
Yeah, Lauren, I loved the presentation. Thanks for that. I was wondering, based on Nicola's question, how difficult did the participants actually find it? Because you're saying, it's particularly a challenge to think differently to the participants. And I've made the experience that, if methods are too creative, participants can, be a bit reluctant. So my question is, how difficult was it actually for them? Because it is kind of a synesthesia that you're expecting from participants here.
It is. I think you can go as creative as you want, but there might always be that barrier. And I think from the smell sketches that I showed, you saw that the participant smell sketch was quite linear by design. It was a lot of lines, colors blended in lines, except for the palm tree at the bottom. But the thing is, what's interesting with this, the way I tend to set it up is I have no experience in art. I am not a trained professional. I just picked up a brush, watercolors, and just started painting. So I always frame it of, I'm not an expert. I'll lean into this idea that I am not the expert in this. I'm just interested in what you think. And you've got to think of the paper as a blank canvas. So you can think about how you smell, but then what happens more organically is that they start to blend in colors around emotion. So that's something that was quite a surprise. They weren't just visually representing what they smelled, but they were capturing their emotions, and that was unintentional, but also kind of anticipated in a sense that, fragrance is actually quite an emotional topic. But it was really interesting. It's at first, some participants did express that hesitation and that apprehension, but once they got into the swing of it, the playfulness of it, they absolutely loved it. They were just like, can I have another sheet? Just to carry on painting more.
Yeah. Can imagine. It's unleashing people's creativity there. That's amazing.
Yeah, because it's sort of like Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way. I don't know if you know book. But very quickly, final question. But I was interested around, because, no surprise, AI in research at the moment, we're all battling the, AI moderated qualitative research, whereas this feels refreshingly so anti-AI. But it did make me think of AI is also now starting to be used more in that creativity space, like Midjourney, and even ChatGPT with image. So have you thought about how you could potentially translate some of this in an AI world?
I think it's not impossible. I know, you can take participant descriptions and the verbatim and use them as prompts to generate images as a tool of elicitation. So you can do that live in session when you're with a participant and then show them that image and see, is that a reflection of your experience? I think it depends on the topic at hand. I think obviously for me, when I was looking at the relationships in particular with perfume, it's such a complex story that even you could put in 10,000 words of prompts and still not capture what you think, what that smell is to that person. So I think it's a time and a place. I don't think it's impossible. Do I think it's lacking at this point in terms of actually capturing how a participant really feels about a fragrance? Probably.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear you say that. And I think that's what I love about this topic and kind of that fragrance research, that no matter what, there's such a physicality to it, like as in, human physicality and touch, and that AI for now can't take away. So, which is good. Well, look, thank you so much, Lauren. This has been brilliant. Yes, I was scribbling notes there, as I'm sure many who'll be watching this will be. And we really appreciate your time. So thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you
Yeah, thanks
at
so
the
much.
next conference.